The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, President of the Council of State and the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Cuba. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, President of the Council of State and the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Cuba, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, it is impossible to be here and speak from this rostrum on behalf of Cuba and not to recall historical moments of the General Assembly, which are also part of our dearest memories. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Raúl Castro
y el canciller de la dignidad, por solo citar los más trascendentes, trajeron hasta aquí no solo la voz de nuestro pueblo, sino la de otros pueblos latinoamericanos y asiáticos no alineados con los que hemos
with whom we have shared over half a century of battles for a just international order that is still far from being reached. It is absurd but consistent with the rationality of a world in which the richest 0.7% of the population owns 46% of all the wealth, while the poorest 70% of the population can access only 2.7% of it. 3.4 billion people survive in poverty. 815 million are going hungry, 758 million are illiterate, and 844 million lack basic services of drinking water. All these figures, by the way, are prepared and regularly used by global organizations, but it seems that they have failed yet still to raise sufficient awareness of the international community. Mr. President, these realities are not the result of socialism, like the President of the United States said yesterday here. They are the consequence of capitalism, especially imperialism and neoliberalism, of selfishness and exclusion that is inherent to that system, and of economic, political, social, and cultural paradigm that privileges wealth accumulation in the hands of a few at the cost of the exploitation and the poverty of the large majorities. Capitalism consolidated colonialism. It gave birth to fascism, terrorism, and apartheid, and spread wars and conflicts, the breaches of sovereignty and self-determination of the peoples, repression on workers, minorities, refugees, and migrants. Capitalism is opposed to solidarity and democratic participation. The production and consumption patterns that characterize it promote plundering, militarism, threats to peace. They generate violations of human rights and are the greatest danger to the ecological balance of the planet and the survival of human beings. No one should be deceived by anybody claiming that humanity lacks enough material, financial, and technological resources to eradicate poverty, hunger, preventable diseases, and other scourges. What is lacking is the political will of the industrial countries who have the moral duty, the historical responsibility, and the abundant resources to solve the most pressing global problems. The truth is that while it is claimed that there is a shortfall in funding to attain the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda or address the increasing impact of climate change, in 2017, the military expenditure amounted to 1.74 trillion, the highest figure since the end of the Cold War. Climate change is another unavoidable reality and a matter of survival for the human species, particularly for small island developing states. Some of its effects are already irreversible. Scientific evidence indicates there is an increase of 1.1 centigrade degrees relative to the industrial period, and 9 out of 10 persons are living polluted air, breathing polluted air. However, the U.S., one of the most important polluters yesterday and today, refuses to accompany the international community in the implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change. It thus endangers the lives of future generations and the survival of all species, including humans. In addition, and as if there were not enough threats on humanity and its dazzling creations, it is a fact that the military and nuclear hegemonism of imperialism is perpetuating itself and expanding to the detriment of the hopes of the majority of the peoples for a general and complete disarmament. It is an idea Cuba shares, and as proof of its commitment, on January the 31st last, Cuba became the fifth state to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In this organization that was born out of the human desire to overcome the destruction left by a terrible war with the dialogue between nations, it is not possible not to ignore these dangers that include the aggression wars disguised as humanitarian interventions, the forceful overthrow of sovereign governments, the so-called soft coups, and interference in other states' internal affairs. These are recurrent forms of actions by some powers using the most diverse excuses. International cooperation for the promotion and protection of all human rights for all is a must. However, its discriminatory and selective manipulation with claims of domination violates the rights to peace, self-determination, and development of peoples. Cuba rejects the militarization of outer space and cyberspace, as well as the covert and illegal use of information and communication technologies to attack other states. The exercise of multilateralism and the full respect for the principles and rules of international law to advance towards a multipolar, democratic, and equitable world are requirements to guarantee peaceful coexistence, preserve international peace and security, and find lasting solutions to systemic problems. Against that logic, the threat of the use of force, unilateralism, pressures, retaliations, and sanctions, which increasingly characterize the behavior and rhetoric of the U.S. government and its abusive use of the veto power in the Security Council in order to impose their political agenda, pose huge challenges and threats within the United Nations itself. Why don't we just implement the promised strengthening of the General Assembly as the main organ of deliberation, decision, and representation? The reform of the Security Council must not be delayed or prevented, as this organ is in need of adjusting its to the times in its work and membership. Today, we have come to reiterate what Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruz said on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the UN, which summarizes the most noble aspiration of the majority of humanity, and I quote, "We want a world without hegemonistic practices, without nuclear weapons, without interventionism, without racism, without national or religious hatred, without violations of the sovereignty of any country, respect for independence and the free determination of peoples, without universal models that do not take into account the traditions and cultures of all components of humanity at all, without cruel blockades that kill men, women, children, young and elderly persons like silent atomic bombs." Over 20 years have passed since that demand, and none of those ills have been cured. In fact, they have worsened. We have every right to ask why, and we have the duty to insist on effective and equitable solutions. Mr. President, our America is today experiencing persistent threats inconsistent with the proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace, signed in Havana by the heads of state and government on the occasion of the second summit of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States in 2014. The current U.S. administration has proclaimed the relevance of the Monroe Doctrine and, in a new deployment of its imperial policy in the region, is attacking Venezuela with a special cruelty. In that threatening context, we wish to reiterate our absolute support to the Bolivarian and Chavista revolution, the civic military union of the Venezuelan people, and the legitimate and democratic government led by Constitutional President Nicolás Maduro Moros. We reject the intervention attempts and sanctions against Venezuela, aimed at suffocating it economically and hurting Venezuelan families. We likewise reject the attempts at destabilizing the Nicaraguan government, a country of peace that has made a remarkable social, economic, and public safety progress in favor of its people. We denounce the politically motivated imprisonment of former President Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva and the decision to prevent the people from voting and electing Brazil's most popular leader to the presidency. We stand in solidarity with the Caribbean nations who demand legitimate reparation for the horrible effects of slavery, as well as the just, special, and differential treatment that they deserve. We reaffirm our historical commitment with the self-determination and independence of the brotherly people of Puerto Rico. We support Argentina's legitimate sovereignty claim over the Malvinas Islands, South Sandwich, and South Georgia Islands. We reiterate our unrestricted support to the comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of the creation of two states, allowing the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination and to have an independent and sovereign state based upon the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. We reject the unilateral action of the United States to establish its diplomatic representation in the city of Jerusalem, which heightens even more tensions in the region. We condemn the barbarities of the Israeli forces against the civilian population in Gaza. We reaffirm our steadfast solidarity with the Saharan people and support the search for the final solution to the question of Western Sahara, which will allow them to exercise self-determination and to live in peace in their territory. We support the search for a peaceful and negotiated solution to the situation imposed in Syria without foreign interference and with full respect to its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We reject any direct or indirect intervention carried out without the legitimate authorities of that country.
The continued expansion of NATO towards the Russian borders is causing serious threats worsened by the imposition of arbitrary sanctions, which we reject. We demand compliance with the Islamic Republic of Iran's nuclear deal. We welcome the process of rapprochement and dialogue between the two Koreas, which is the way for achieving a lasting peace, reconciliation, and stability in the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, we strongly condemn the imposition of unilateral and unfair sanctions against the Democratic Republic People's Republic of Korea and foreign interference in Korean internal affairs, the violation of the rules of international trade, and the sanctions against China, the European Union, and other countries will bring about harmful effects, particularly for developing states. We advocate for dialogue and cooperation, thanks to which we can report today that the Cuba-EU Agreement on Political Dialogue and Cooperation has provisionally entered into force and is a good foundation to develop beneficial ties between both parties. Mr. President, the government of the U.S. keeps an aggressive rhetoric towards Cuba and maintains a policy aimed at subverting the political, economic, social, economic, and cultural system in my country, contrary to the interests of both peoples and giving in to the pressures of a minority of sectors. The new U.S. government has devoted itself to artificially fabricate under false pretenses scenarios of tension and hostility that serve nobody's interests. This is in contrast with the fact that we have formal diplomatic relations and mutually beneficial cooperation programs in a limited number of areas. Our peoples share increasingly closer historic and cultural bonds, which are expressed in the arts, sports, sciences, in the environment, among others. The potential for a smooth, fluent business relationship is well known, and a genuine and respectful understanding would be in the best interest of the entire region. However, the essential and defining element of the bilateral relationship continues to be the blockade, which seeks to suffocate the Cuban economy in order to bring about hardships and disrupt our constitutional order. It is a cruel policy punishing Cuban families and the entire nation. It is the most comprehensive and long-standing system of economic nations or sanctions ever implemented. It has been and continues to be a major obstacle to the country's development and to the realization of the aspirations to progress and well-being of several generations of Cubans. As it has been said for so many years in this same forum, due to its aggressive extraterritorial implementation, the blockade seriously damages the sovereignty and interests of all countries. On behalf of the Cuban people, I would like to thank this General Assembly for the virtually unanimous rejection of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States against my country. Nevertheless, the actions of the U.S. government against my country go further. They include public and covert programs of gross interference in Cuba's internal affairs. To this end, tens of millions of dollars are officially allocated in its budget in violation of the standards and principles upon which this organization lies, and in particular on Cuba's sovereignty as an independent nation. Cuba stands ready to develop respectful and civilized relations with the U.S. government on the basis of sovereign equality and mutual respect. This is the will of the Cuban people, and we know this is a shared aspiration by most U.S. citizens, and particularly by Cubans living here. We shall continue to tirelessly demand the end of the cruel economic, commercial, and financial blockade, the return of the illegally occupied territory of the Guantanamo Naval Base, and adequate reparations for our people, for the thousands of the dead and disabled, and for the economic and property damages caused to Cuba over so many years of aggression. Cuba will always be willing to engage in dialogue and cooperate on the basis of respect and on an equal footing. We shall never make concessions affecting the sovereignty and national independence. We shall not negotiate our principles, nor shall we accept conditionalities. In spite of the blockade, the hostility, and the actions carried out by the United States to impose a regime change in Cuba, the Cuban Revolution is right here, alive and kicking, true to its principle. Mr. President, the generational change in our government should not raise the hopes of the enemies of the revolution. We are the continuity, not a rupture. Cuba has continued taking steps to improve its model of economic and social development in order to build a sovereign, independent, socialist, democratic, prosperous, and sustainable nation. That is the path we have chosen freely. The Cuban people will never go back to the opprobrious past that it shook off with the greatest sacrifices during 150 years of struggle for independence and full dignity. By the decision of the overwhelming majority of Cubans, we shall continue the process that started almost 60 years ago. In this conviction, we began a constitutional reform process, a truly participatory and democratic exercise, through popular discussion of the draft, which will eventually be approved in a referendum. I am certain that there will be no changes in our strategic objectives and that the irrevocable nature of socialism will be ratified. The principles of foreign policy will remain unchanged. As the first secretary of our party, Raúl Castro, said on his statement on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, and I quote, "The international community will always be able to count on Cuba's sincere voice against injustice, inequality, underdevelopment, discrimination, and manipulation, and for the establishment of a fairer and more equitable international order whose center is placed on the human being, its dignity and well-being. The Cuba on behalf of which I speak today is the proud successor of that independent, sovereign, fraternal, and solidarity policy with the poorest of this world, producers of all the wealth in the planet, although the unequal global order has sentenced them to dire poverty, on behalf of words like democracy, freedom, and human rights, words which the rich have actually emptied of meaning. It has been exciting to take the floor at the same rostrum from which Fidel expressed powerful truths 50 8 years ago that still continue to shake us in front of representatives of more than 190 nations who, rejecting extortion and pressures, every year fill the voting screen of worthy green lights of approval to our demand for the end of the blockade. I conclude by expressing my hope that the noble aspirations of most of the humanity will be achieved before younger generations take again this rostrum to demand the same things we demand today and our historic predecessors did before us. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank His Excellency Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, President of the Council of State and the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Cuba, for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the Head of State.